I am going to read. It's a pity that it's not in Spanish, because in Spanish I can talk without much problem. But so I asked, to just to put here the text for you to read, because of my accent is a macaronic accent. So it's race and place in the colonial perspective. Runa Alpa Kamaska is not pronounced like that, but it's a Quechua expression, was a sentence pronounced one day by the cacique José Domingo Choquehuanca, which is not the actual vice president of Bolivia, it's another Choquehuanca, born in Puno in August 1789, taken and popularized later in Spanish by Atahualpa Yupanqui, the great Argentine poet and musician. El hombre es tierra que anda. And later still, it will be pronounced by the great Peruvian thinker who formulated the perspective of coloniality, of power and knowledge. Aníbal Quijano, a great connoisseur of the Yupanquian songbook, and he himself, cradled in Quechua by his grandmother, also said, "Man is earth that walks." In more recent times, I have added and unfolding a new translation, which will remain as the subtitle of this conference. Race and place, we are walking particles of a landscape, and which I intend to explain in the course of it. Naming is our task, the task of people who dedicate themselves to the field of the humanities, intellectuals, theoreticians, philosophers of all kinds, do work in the labor of naming, which in certain scenarios is also a labor of moving, dancing, singing, painting, or sculpting. But our species, we must accept, as Heidegger said, is a wording species. So an author is a namer. Giving birth to names will bring to life in a reflexive way what has remained until the moment of nomination as a blind spot in the visual field of an era. And those names emerge and transform the consciousness and even the way we live. What Quijano said, his approach and his vocabulary traveled. The terms he used can be heard at conferences, in seminars, and in classrooms. However, as he himself often pointed out, and not without some righteous anger, more often than not, they had circulated his words like coins of an academic market, or even as cliches of an intellectual fashion. He got very upset with this for two reasons: because of the superficiality with which his vocabulary was and is used, and because he knew that the such use would inevitably lead to a fast obsolescence. Humanities are powerful because in our field are generated the names that shape reality, providing the reading agreed for providing the reading grid for history, and therefore formatting the future. Moreover, authors' relationship with the categories they invent is not a relation of property. It is not, but is one of filiation, of parenthood. Authors are not owners of the names they proposed. They are mothers and fathers. If that is not recognized, we will be unable to truly understand what names really say. In the case of the very notion of coloniality and of the perspective of the coloniality of power and knowledge, there has been a very problematic disrespect for the parenthood that gave rise to it. Such disregard led the public to an ignorance towards the setting to which those words belong. Aníbal Quijano always spoke of his contribution not as a theory, but as a perspective. With that, he tried to emphasize not merely its systematic nature, but its organic, living character, a thinking that was better understood as alive, a living organism affected by time and continuing to grow thanks to the grafting and unfolding provided by other authors. It's a way of looking at things, at history, and at the globe. Quijano's words have circulated scattered, isolated, and therefore disconnected. They have migrated to the epistemic north, separated from the original matrix that gave cohesion to their meaning. The deep interconnection that they actually had in their origin as part of the living organism that looks at the world in a recognizable manner, more than a system of thought. I will refer here to the elements some elements of his perspective that refer to space and time, expanding his definition of race and adding a new category to his proposition. For Quijano, coining the neologism coloniality was required because the structure imposed by conquest and colonization continues today to shape the world order and human subjectivity. Although the historical period governed by a colonial legal system and slavery has ended, coloniality goes on. So one of the words tailoring his conception of time and space was the idea of a re-originalization of history, organizing anew along a short period of years our perception about the space and territory after the event of conquest. This shift in perspective reveals that the colonial event re-originated the world by creating categories that did not exist before. Indian, Black, and white now classify human beings in a new way that would then serve as a basis for the exploitation of the modern world system, a classification that national independence never dissolved. Our countries, our nations went into an independent states. But that order, that structure, they did not touch. Therefore, coloniality remained and propagated as a pattern for work exploitation, social hierarchies, political administration, and even subjectivity itself. Before the Iberian ships had arrived to the shores of the Caribbean and Abya Yala, there was not only America, but there were no Europe, nor Spain, and nor Portugal. Let us not forget the revealing year in which the unification of the Iberian Peninsula took place upon the conquest of the Emirate of Granada. That was the year of 1492. It's very shocking to understand that it's the same year where those ships reached the other side of the sea. So the path of conquest and colonization passed from one side of the big sea to the other side of the big sea without a break of continuity in the same year. And the categories like Indian, Black, and white did not exist either. So the world is like recreated at that moment. It's a very short period of time. According to Quijano, and later supported by his friend Immanuel Wallerstein, in a work that they both wrote together and published in 1992, the first scene of the change in perspective was the reordering of history, which inverts the order of precedence typical of a historical imagination that is already fixed in the West, and now asserts that America invented Europe. This is so because the New World emerges as a new space. The American novelty displaces the European tradition and establishes the spirit of modernity as an orientation towards the future. Upon the emergence of America, the golden age runs from the past to the future. The source of legitimation that moved from the past, the sacred history that, being interpreted by priests, validated, gave legitimacy, and admitted or not scientific breakthroughs and technological inventions. I mean, legitimacy came from the past. When what we call today America appeared, legitimacy traveled to the future and came from the future. That is the colonial shift. It is here the essence of Quijano's proposition, contribution. Since then, novelty turns into value. Before, there wasn't a value. It has to be authorized. Novelty turns into a value, and what defines the spirit of modernity appears on the horizon. The act of discovering is discovered as a historical project and as a source of value. That is why, in Quijano's discourse, colonial comes before modernity, thus creating the expression of colonial modernity, in order to state beyond any doubt that the colonial process was a precondition, a condition of possibility for modernity to have birth. As is known, the conquest and colonization were also the preconditions of capitalism, since only, as Marx himself said, since only the minerals of the New World would allow for the primitive accumulation of the initial phase of capital. The emergence of America, its foundation as a continent, as a category, reconfigures the world and originates the only vocabulary we have today to narrate such story. History is re-originated. The decolonial shift takes place when we realize that it is impossible to narrate the process of conquest and colonization without using a vocabulary that following the event. I mean, who is not previous, but is posterior to the event. When we narrate this process, we are already located in a re-originated world, a new world in which we can only speak the categories that did not exist before. For example, we say Spain discovered America, but this is an untenable statement since Spain did not exist before America. It is interesting that we often and inevitably repeat the word discovery, even if we know that there were people in the continent before the ships arrived. So it was not discovered. But the slip of tongue reveals that we are naming something else, the novelty of discovering itself as a value. That is to say, the discovery of discovery. Though including elements of the Marxist critique, Quijano splits apart from Marxism and also from the group of authors of the theory of dependency to which he belonged when he, inspired in Mariátegi's critique, proposes that race and not class is the bedrock of his perspective and the pillar of the new pattern of power established through the re-originalization of history introduced by conquest and colonization. The process of progressive exclusion was not going to be overcome and will continue and become permanent. In his 7 interpretive essays on Peruvian reality, Mariátegui wrote, the concept of inferior races was useful to the white man's West purposes of expansion and conquest. So the white man's West purposes of expansion and conquest. For Quijano, race is a colonial invention, a category that did not exist before conquest and colonization. Earlier, there were other forms of discrimination, the idea of another, a barbarian people in the antiquity, and other forms of xenophobic exclusion, discrimination, and antagonism existed. But for Quijano, there was a difference in the colonial modern invention of race. The racialized other resulted from the attribution of a different nature to those whose territories were usurped, stolen by conquest. Their bodies were attributed a different biology, and otherness anchored in the organism, therefore impossible to undo. Quijano stated, the idea of race in its modern meaning does not have a known history before colonization of America. Perhaps it originated in reference to the phenotypic differences between conqueror and conquered. However, what matters is that soon it was construed to refer to the supposed differential biological structure of those groups. So race was an attribution of a different biology to the bodies of the people who were expropriated by colonization. Social relations founded on the category of race produced new historical social identities in America, Indian, Blacks, and Mestizos, and redefined others. Terms such as Spanish and Portuguese and later European, which had until then indicated only geographic origin or country of origin, acquired from then on a racial connotation in reference to the new identities. Insofar as the social relations that were being configured were relations of domination, such identities were considered constitutive of hierarchies of places and corresponding social roles. This paragraph helps to elucidate the distinction between Wallerstein's modern world system and Quijano's coloniality of power, or colonial modern world system. It points out, additionally, that racialization goes beyond skin color and what was described as the ethno-racial pentagon in the United States during the 70s, white, Asian American, African American, Native American, Hispanic Latino. The ethno-racial pentagon is the current and local manifestation of a larger phenomenon, the classification and the ranking of people, continents, nations, and regions of the world. Quijano's groundbreaking argumentation brought to light that the colonial differential that held together the colonial modern world system was built and maintained on the concept of race and its particular way of extracting surplus value from the labor of racialized bodies and the undervaluation of their products and knowledge as an effect of Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism understood as the other face of racism. Racism applied to the reading of the bodies and Eurocentrism to that of their products and knowledge. So I added to this definition that we have to understand the race. So I go on now to my own additions to Quijano's propositions. That we have to understand that race is a sign of a position in history read by an eye informed by that history. The race is read in the bodies by the identification of signs that can tell where that body was located and played its role in colonial history and in permanent coloniality still today among us. So race is read in the bodies by a historical eye. Only that can explain the many examples available of the variations of such reading. I will mention only a few. So the eye that attributes race is an eye that knows history of colony and conquest and colony. And for the shape of that body, sort of takes signs of where that body was in history, and then attributes race. Race is the consequence of that attribution by an eye that knows that historical process. The very case of Fanon, with the painful narration of his book, Black Skin, White Masks, of his arrival in Paris, believing himself to be French because he was really a scholar. He was really a scholar of French knowledge, when he realizes that the Parisian eye places him somewhere else, a Negro. His place, and that is so because his place in Martinique, and this I never saw that told in any other place. His place, Martinique, where he belonged to the enlightened class and to the elite. So he could never foresee the possibility that he wasn't a French person, because in his original country, Martinique, he belonged to the enlightened class and to the elite of the island. Or a Brazilian professor astonished when he tells, I don't understand. I got on the plane white in Sao Paulo and got off black in the United States. How that can happen? So for me, those examples are very important because they tell you how race is a relationship. And most of all, which is a theme of my paper, that race is a consequence of place. Where do you belong? Where you belong. Or the people of the Dominican Republic, with a large percentage of Afro-descendants in its population, and in the middle of the Spanish Caribbean, who nevertheless attributes blackness to Haitians. This is really surprising. Or the Japanese businessmen, when they came to South Africa in apartheid times, staying in white hotels as honorary whites. So the attribution of race is very interested indeed. It doesn't come from the essence of the body. It comes from relationships in the world. Or a Spanish girl complaining, I heard that the other day, complaining bitterly that when she filled in a form in the multicultural United States, she was classified in the same category as Hispanics, despite thinking that she was European. So it's very confusing. So race is not an essence in the body, a nature emanated from the body, as common sense leads us to think. Race is place, and bodies are particles of a landscape walking in the world, a world classified and reoriginated in the history of conquest and colonization. We are the place we carry with us. Therefore, it is not we who are rooted in the land where we were born, but it is the land, its landscape, that is rooted in us. Echoing here the phrase with which the Amerindian Indians express the reason of their aspiration for the return of their territories. The land does not belong to us, but we belong to the land. This is what they say. I would just like to add here that the idea of permanent coloniality, I have added the idea of conquistuality, that is also permanent. Depending on where we live, we can see that in a world without the rule of law, as it is today, our world, it is possible to see that conquest is still spreading. I have been developing this concept for some time without the space here to expand on this analysis. All right. Looking at the world from the border, inhabiting the frontier. In her now classic 1987 essay, Borderlands, La Frontera, the New Mestiza, Gloria Anzaldúa spoke of the existential and epistemic position of inhabiting the border, being mestiza. And in an important anthology of his texts, Habitar la Frontera, Sentir y Pensar la Descolonialidad, published recently in 2015, Walter Mignolo proposes the border as a possible way out to overcome the order of coloniality. In my book, The Nation and Its Others, I develop a critique of the essentialized identities proposed by North American multiculturalism. Today, that initial discomfort has been transformed into a critique of the minoritization that we have accepted and complied with in order to reap the benefits of the multicultural proposal. which was nothing more than the delivery by the capitalist West of a somewhat enhanced and racialized distributionism as a counterbalance to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Both were attempts as a conciliatory movement in that period of the fall of the Berlin Wall. The East gave the dissolution of the Soviet territory, and the West gave multiculturalism. This is my understanding, and I argued for that in my book, in one of my books. I say there, among other things, that the political identities formatted and essentialized in the process canceled out in this process of multiculturalism, these political identities canceled out, obliterated local, national, and regional forms of constructed otherness, relations of power and coexistence rooted in their own landscapes. I say that racism is a global post-conquest, but that histories are local, and I contrast the political identities emanating from the North with the historical alterities rooted in the landscapes of the South. I understand the border on the basis of a series of theoretical-political reflections that I have already made. And I perceive, like the authors mentioned, that looking at the world from the frontier, may be a way out that allows us to go beyond the essentialist way of thinking and the traps in which coloniality captures us. Without wishing to expand here, I leave it as an outline to continue this reflection. My future guidelines are, some of them, no? I have a lot, but proposing, as I did many years ago, that there were two ethical drives, two ethical sensibilities, the two ethical schemes, the ethics of disobedience, which I took that expression from Foucault, the ethics of disobedience, and the ethics of conformity. The ethics of disobedience is that which, following Levinas's orientation and guided by the face of the other, the one which shows us the limits of the world we have, opening the door to the other possibilities. The subjects thus situated in the frontier because they can see their own world from within and from without. So this is the frontier itself. When you can see your own world, with a foot inside this world and with another foot outside that world. So this is much better than seeing the world from only one side, as the ethics of conformity does. The paraconsistent logic of the Andean world, for example, where I live, where people worship Pachamama and live in a Pachamamic cosmos, but they are also Christians. In other words, they inhabit a frontier and cross it all the time. One can perceive there that the essentialism and the consistent, exclusive, and excluding logic of the religions of conversions, which is as the monotheisms, and the paraconsistent logic, open logic of the religions of initiation, according to a difference that I have pointed out in previous texts between these two lives of worship. The religions of initiation allow us the transits and acknowledge multiple frontiers that dwell inside us. But the religions of conversion oblige you to exclude all the other possibilities of faith. So the frontier would be thus, this space of inconsistency. I have found the same in the variants of the African religion in Brazil, the candomblé, who may think of a place where their dead live, a neighboring room where they are fed in the corresponding ceremonies, but they also can think that they go to the heaven of the redemption of the Christians, and there is no trouble at all in believing both. I found that really superior. This open and possible transit affirms that they inhabit the frontier. It affirms inconsistency as a virtue, as transformative ethics, unsatisfied, and it affirms disobedience as a virtue as well, etc., etc., etc.